Did you know that in ancient Greece, if you couldn't pay your debts, you could end up getting sold as a slave? Sounds insane, right? But the craziest part is that this law was just the beginning of some of the weirdest, most bizarre laws ever written in history. Stick around, because we're diving deep into some of the most mind-blowing ancient laws that will make you say, what were they thinking? Laws are meant to keep society in check, right? Well, some of the ancient ones might actually make you glad you're living in modern times. Ancient civilizations weren't shy about coming up with strange, sometimes downright horrifying rules to govern their people. From bizarre punishments to laws that seem like they came straight out of a dystopian movie. We're about to look at some of the most mind-blowing laws that ancient people lived by. Some of these rules were all about control, some were meant to keep order, and others were just plain bizarre. But one thing's for sure, these laws weren't written with today's sensibilities in mind. So sit tight and prepare yourself for some seriously weird, crazy ancient laws. Crazy law number 1. Ancient Greece's debt slavery. Let's start in ancient Greece, where debts could literally destroy your life. If you couldn't pay off what you owed, you didn't just get a bad credit score, you could get sold into slavery. That's right. If you couldn't pay, your creditors could take you and your family and put you up for sale. It was called debt bondage, and it was a real thing. But what makes this even crazier is that this wasn't some rare event. It was happening all the time in places like Athens and Sparta. Imagine being in a situation where your entire future was at the mercy of someone else's wealth. Scary, right? Now, it wasn't like people were getting thrown into debt slavery for a couple of bucks. No, the debts were usually much larger, often from loans taken out for business purposes or from personal expenses. But here's the wild part. Families didn't just have their homes taken or their property seized, they were taken too. The head of the household, his wife, his children, all could end up being auctioned off. And guess what? It wasn't just men who faced this fate. Women and children were also sold into slavery if the family couldn't make good on what they owed. Imagine being a parent back then. You could literally work your entire life to build up some wealth and end up losing everything, even your children, because of a financial slip-up. In fact, there were times when entire families were auctioned off as slaves to settle debts. It was one of the most terrifying aspects of ancient Greek life, and it definitely kept the population in line. Crazy law number 2. Roman infanticide laws. Now, let's talk about one of the most shocking practices in ancient Rome: baby abandonment. The Romans had this weird law about exposure, which meant if you had a baby you couldn't afford or didn't want, you could just leave them in the wild. No one cared. It was totally legal. The child could be left to die, or if they were lucky, someone else might pick them up and raise them. But here's the messed up part. This wasn't just a random choice. Roman parents had a right to abandon their children, especially if they were born deformed, disabled, or unwanted for any other reason. It was seen as a form of population control, and while it might sound barbaric, it was totally normal back then. Babies could be left at crossroads, outside temples, or in public places, sometimes even near the edge of the city, where they were exposed to the elements. Sometimes, they were just abandoned without much thought at all. The worst part, the Romans had no qualms about it. In fact, many Roman laws protected this practice. It was accepted, and there were even people who made money off finding abandoned babies and taking them in as slaves, gladiators, or prostitutes. But here's the really creepy part. Some of the most famous gladiators were once abandoned babies. If they survived the wild, they could end up training to fight to the death for the entertainment of the crowds. So, in ancient Rome, getting left on the streets wasn't just a fate that could befall the poor, it could happen to anyone, even the children of wealthy families. Crazy law number 3. The Assyrian eye for an eye laws. Now, let's travel to ancient Assyria, where revenge was taken to a whole new level. The Assyrians were hardcore when it came to their laws, especially when it came to punishment. If you committed a crime, it was all about paying back the same way you hurt someone else. We're talking about a straight-up eye for an eye style of justice. But it wasn't just the crime itself that was punished, it was the method. For example, let's say you were caught stealing. You wouldn't just get a slap on the wrist. Oh no, you'd get your hands chopped off. If you killed someone, well, don't even think about getting away with it. You could be executed by the same method you used to kill your victim. Kill with a sword. You're getting the sword. But it didn't stop there. Punishment could be as extreme as you can imagine. If you were caught lying about a crime, you could get impaled. Or if you disrespected a king's authority, the law would order you to be buried alive. These Assyrian laws were brutal, and they didn't mess around. People lived in fear that any wrong move could mean certain death. Here's a particularly horrifying example. If you were caught committing adultery, the punishment was not just for the guilty party. Both the man and the woman would be tied up and thrown into a pit of wild animals. If the animals didn't kill them, they'd be left to die a slow, painful death by exposure. Crazy law number 4. The Code of Hammurabi. Speaking of laws that didn't mess around, let's dive into the famous Code of Hammurabi. One of the oldest legal codes in human history. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, wrote a massive list of laws about everything from family life to business dealings. And guess what? If you broke any of these laws, the punishments were straight up terrifying. For example, if a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder would be put to death. If a son hit his father, his hand would be chopped off. The laws were extremely strict, and there was no room for ups moments. Everything was on a zero-tolerance policy. But here's the interesting twist. These laws were meant to maintain order in society. They were so strict because Hammurabi wanted everyone to know exactly what would happen if they broke the law. It was like a constant reminder of the consequences. And while many of these laws might seem harsh today, they were revolutionary at the time, setting the stage for modern legal systems. The Code of Hammurabi didn't just punish criminals. It also laid out guidelines for everything from commerce to personal conduct. If a person was caught lying about a contract or stealing, they could face severe fines or even the death penalty. No one was exempt from Hammurabi's laws, and they were carved in stone for everyone to see, which means everyone knew the rules. Crazy law number 5. Ancient Egyptian mummification laws. Let's talk about Egypt now. You know how we think of mummies as wrapped up bodies in tombs? Well, back in ancient Egypt, mummification wasn't just a funeral practice, it was tied to some very strange laws. In ancient Egypt, your social status had everything to do with how you were mummified. You see, if you were rich and powerful, you had the chance to get a top-tier mummification. We're talking about preservation techniques that would make you look as fresh as a daisy for the afterlife. But if you were poor, well, your mummification process was pretty basic or worse, non-existent. Some people's bodies would be left to rot because they couldn't afford to be embalmed. And if you were found guilty of committing certain crimes, you wouldn't just face punishment in life, you would be punished in the afterlife too. One of the most horrifying ancient Egyptian laws. If you stole from a tomb, you were damned to wander the underworld forever. That's a punishment that even the bravest souls feared. Crazy law number 6. The witchcraft laws of medieval England. We're moving into medieval England, where laws about witchcraft were some of the wildest and most terrifying of the time. The fear of witches was so high that any woman accused of practicing magic could be sentenced to death. But here's where it gets crazy. All it took was a little accusation, and you were done for. One of the laws that made life particularly brutal for women was the Witchcraft Act of 1563. This law stated that anyone found guilty of using magic to harm another person could be executed. And not just executed in a quick and easy way. No. The accused could be burned alive, hanged, or even pressed to death with stones. The act was so widely feared that anyone who was accused of witchcraft, even if they were completely innocent, had almost no chance of surviving the trial. The craziest part, people would often accuse their neighbors just to get rid of them. It was like a free pass to eliminate anyone you didn't like. Imagine being a woman living in medieval England, where your life could be destroyed by a simple accusation of witchcraft. Crazy law number 7. Sparta's brutal eugenics laws. Let's finish up with the laws of ancient Sparta, which take the cake when it comes to brutal and insane. Spartans didn't mess around when it came to survival of the fittest. Their laws were all about creating a perfect warrior society, and that meant getting rid of anything that wasn't up to par. At birth, a Spartan child would be inspected by the elders. If the baby was deemed weak or deformed, it was left to die. This wasn't just an accident. The Spartans had a law called exposure, where babies who weren't deemed strong enough for Sparta's military society were abandoned to the elements. Survival of the fittest wasn't just a phrase, it was a way of life. But it wasn't just babies who were affected. If a Spartan warrior was injured in battle, their ability to fight again was scrutinized. If they couldn't keep up, they were left behind. There was no place for weakness in Sparta, and those laws ensured that only the strongest survived. As you can see, ancient laws were sometimes downright brutal and harsh, way more extreme than what we're used to today. But these laws were born out of the need to control populations, maintain power, and protect the way of life in each society. In a lot of ways, they shaped the world we live in today, setting the groundwork for modern legal systems, even if some of them were a little over the top. So the next time you think your traffic ticket is bad, just remember, you could have been sentenced to death for stealing a loaf of bread in ancient Rome.